I never thought rope could mean anything more than securing cargo until I met him on the docks that summer. I was 23, fresh out of college, with a useless degree in literature, and no idea what to do with my life. My uncle owned a small shipping company in Portland, and he offered me a job doing inventory and paperwork while I figured things out. I took it because my apartment wasn't going to pay for itself, and honestly, I needed something mindless after 4 years of analyzing poetry and pretending to understand postmodern theory. The warehouse smelled like salt water, diesel fuel, and something else I couldn't quite name. Something ancient and weathered. I showed up that first Monday morning in khakis and a button-down shirt like an absolute idiot. My uncle took one look at me and laughed so hard he nearly choked on his coffee. He told me to go home and change into something I didn't mind ruining. When I came back in jeans and an old t-shirt, he introduced me to the crew. That's when I saw Finn for the first time. He was coiling rope near the edge of the dock, his hands moving with this practiced efficiency that made it look like a dance. He was probably in his late 20s, with sun-weathered skin and dark hair that fell into his eyes when he bent over his work. He wore a faded grey tank top that showed off arms corded with lean muscle, the kind you get from actual labour, not from a gym. There was a tattoo on his left forearm, an anchor wrapped in rope. But I couldn't make out the details from where I stood. My uncle called him over. "Finn, this is my nephew Adrian. He'll be doing the office work. But I want him to understand how everything operates out here first. Show him the ropes." My uncle grinned at his own terrible pun. Finn looked at me with these sea-glass green eyes that seemed to see right through my nervous smile. He nodded once, wiped his hand on his jeans, and held it out to me. His grip was firm and calloused, his palm rough against mine. "You ever worked on a dock before?" he asked. His voice was lower than I expected, with a slight rasp to it. I shook my head. He almost smiled. It wasn't quite a smile, just this slight upturn at the corner of his mouth. "All right then. Stay close and try not to fall in the water." That was my introduction to Finn Morrison, the man who would completely unravel every assumption I'd ever made about myself. Those first few days I followed him around like a lost puppy, taking notes on my phone about shipping procedures and safety protocols. Finn didn't talk much, but when he did, his words were deliberate and useful. He showed me how to read the manifests, how to identify different types of cargo, how to spot potential problems before they became disasters. But what fascinated me most was watching him work with rope. His hands were constantly moving, tying and untying knots with this casual expertise that seemed almost magical. On my 4th day, I made the mistake of trying to secure a tarp over some equipment. I'd watched the crew do it a dozen times. How hard could it be? I grabbed a rope and attempted something that I thought looked like the knot I'd seen Finn tie that morning. I pulled it tight, feeling pretty proud of myself. Then Finn walked over, took one look at my work, and shook his head. "That's going to come loose the second the wind picks up," he said. "Here, let me show you." He stood behind me, close enough that I could feel the heat radiating off his body. He smelled like rope fiber, sea air, and something clean, like cedar. My heart started beating faster, and I told myself it was just because I was embarrassed about screwing up the knot. He reached around me, his arms bracketing mine, and took the rope from my hands. His fingers brushed against my wrists, and I felt this electric jolt run up my arms. "Watch," he said, his voice right by my ear. "This is a bowline. Rabbit comes out of the hole, goes around the tree, and back down the hole." His hands moved slowly, demonstrating each step. Then he untied it and handed me the rope. "Your turn." I tried to replicate what he'd shown me, my hands shaking slightly. He stood close, watching, occasionally reaching in to guide my fingers into the right position. When I finally got it right, he made that almost smile again. "Good." Now do it 20 more times until your hands remember it without thinking. Over the next few weeks, Finn taught me knots during our lunch breaks. We'd sit on the edge of the dock, our legs dangling over the water, and he'd show me clove hitches, sheet bends, figure eights, trucker's hitches. Each knot had a purpose, a specific situation where it was the right tool for the job. He'd tie them on my wrists to demonstrate, his fingers warm against my skin, and then have me practice until I could do them with my eyes closed. I told myself I was just interested in learning a useful skill. I told myself that the way my pulse jumped every time he touched me was just adrenaline from trying something new. But I was lying to myself, and on some level, I knew it. I started looking forward to those lunch breaks more than anything else in my day. I'd watch the clock all morning, counting down the minutes until I could sit next to Finn and feel his hands on my wrists, teaching me another knot. I started noticing things about him that had nothing to do with rope or shipping or work. The way he squinted when he looked out at the water, the small scar above his left eyebrow, how he always rolled his sleeves up exactly 3 times, the way his whole face changed when he actually smiled, which was rare, but devastating. One afternoon, about 6 weeks into my time at the docks, a summer storm rolled in fast. The sky went from blue to bruised purple in minutes, and the wind picked up so suddenly that loose equipment started sliding across the deck. Everyone scrambled to secure everything before the rain hit. I was trying to tie down a stack of crates when a particularly strong gust nearly knocked me off balance. Finn appeared out of nowhere, steadying me with a hand on my shoulder. "Get inside," he shouted over the wind. "I'll finish this." But I stayed, working alongside him, both of us getting soaked as the rain finally broke. We managed to secure everything just as the storm really unleashed. We ran for the warehouse, laughing breathlessly as thunder cracked overhead. Inside, dripping water all over the concrete floor, Finn grabbed a couple of towels from the supply closet and tossed me one. I watched him dry his face and hair, watched the way his wet shirt clung to his chest and shoulders. He caught me staring and I looked away quickly, feeling heat rise in my cheeks that had nothing to do with the run through the rain. He didn't say anything, just handed me a dry shirt from the emergency supplies. We stood there in the dim warehouse, the storm raging outside, and something shifted between us. The air felt charged with more than just the electricity from the lightning. "You're getting pretty good with the knots," he said quietly. "Thanks to you," I replied. He looked at me for a long moment and I couldn't read the expression in his eyes. Then he turned away and suggested we wait out the worst of the storm before heading back out. That night, lying in bed in my apartment, I finally admitted to myself what I'd been avoiding for weeks. I was attracted to Finn. Not just casually attracted, but intensely, overwhelmingly drawn to him in a way I'd never experienced before. With anyone, man or woman. I'd had girlfriends in college, relationships that felt nice and comfortable and ultimately empty. I'd always assumed I just hadn't met the right person yet. It had never occurred to me that maybe I'd been looking in the wrong direction entirely. The realization terrified me. I'd grown up in a liberal enough family, in a liberal enough city, where being gay wasn't supposed to be a big deal. But it's different when it's you, when it's your own identity suddenly shifting under your feet like sand. I spent hours that night Googling things on my phone. Am I gay if I'm attracted to one man? Can you be straight and fall for a guy? Sexual fluidity, bisexuality, coming out later in life. The internet had a lot of words for what I might be feeling, but none of them quite captured the specific way my stomach flipped when Finn stood close to me, or how I'd started memorizing the exact shade of green in his eyes. The next day at work, I was hyper-aware of everything. Every time Finn came near me, every accidental brush of hands, Every moment his eyes met mine, I felt like my attraction must be written all over my face in neon letters. But if Finn noticed anything different about me, he didn't show it. He was the same as always, quiet and competent, and occasionally almost smiling at something I said. A week later, Finn asked if I wanted to grab a beer after work. My heart jumped into my throat. Sure, I managed to say casually, as if he hadn't just made my entire nervous system light up like a Christmas tree. We went to a dive bar near the docks, the kind of place with sticky floors and a jukebox that only played country music. We sat in a corner booth, and for the first time since I'd met him, Finn really talked. He told me about growing up in a small coastal town in Washington, about working on fishing boats with his father, about how he'd learned knots before he learned to read. He told me about losing his dad to cancer 3 years ago, about drifting down to Portland because he couldn't stand being in his hometown anymore without him. He talked about the ocean like other people talk about religion, with this quiet reverence that made me understand it wasn't just a job for him. It was identity. It was home. I found myself telling him things too, about feeling lost after graduation, about my degree that felt useless, about how I'd always loved stories but had no idea what to do with that love, about how working on the docks had been the first time in months that I'd felt like I was learning something real and useful. He listened with this focused attention that made me feel like every word I said mattered. We stayed until the bar closed, talking and drinking beer and playing terrible country songs on the jukebox. When we finally left, the summer night was warm and clear, stars visible despite the city lights. We walked slowly toward where we'd both parked, neither of us seeming to want the evening to end. At my car, Finn stopped and pulled a length of rope from his pocket. He always had rope on him, I'd noticed. It was like a security blanket. "Give me your wrist," he said. I held out my left hand, and he tied a bracelet around it, a simple series of knots that formed a pattern. "This is a monkey's fist," he said. Well, modified. Sailors used to wear them for luck. His fingers lingered on my wrist after he finished, his thumb brushing over my pulse point. I wondered if he could feel how fast my heart was racing. When he looked up at me, his eyes were darker than usual, and there was something in his expression I couldn't quite name, something that made it hard to breathe. "Thanks," I said, my voice coming out rougher than I intended. He nodded, stepped back, and told me he'd see me Monday. I drove home with my left hand on the steering wheel, hyper-aware of the rope bracelet around my wrist, still warm from his touch. That bracelet became my constant companion. I wore it in the shower, to bed, every single day. It felt like a connection to Finn, like carrying a piece of him with me. At work, things continued as they had been, but with this new undercurrent of something unspoken. We still had our lunch breaks, where he taught me knots. We still worked side by side. But now there were these moments, these looks that lasted just a beat too long, these accidental touches that felt less accidental. I was going crazy trying to figure out if I was imagining the tension between us or if it was real. If Finn felt anything like what I was feeling, or if I was just projecting my own confused attraction onto his friendship. I'd never had to navigate this before. Never had to wonder if someone was interested in me this way. With women, there had been clear social scripts. I had no idea how this worked. One Saturday, about 3 months into working at the docks, Finn texted me. It was the first time he'd ever texted me outside of work logistics. "Want to go sailing?" I stared at the message for a full minute before responding. Yes. He picked me up early the next morning, and we drove to a marina where he kept a small sailboat. "Nothing fancy," he said as we approached it. "But she's mine." We spent the day on the water, and I got to see a different side of Finn. Out there, with the wind in the sails and the sun glittering off the waves, he was more relaxed than I'd ever seen him. He smiled more, laughed more, talked more. He taught me the basics of sailing, patient with my mistakes, encouraging when I got something right. At one point, he stood behind me again, his hands over mine on the tiller, showing me how to feel the boat respond to the wind. I leaned back slightly, letting myself rest against his chest for just a moment, and he didn't move away. We anchored in a quiet cove for lunch. Finn had packed sandwiches and beer in a cooler, and we sat on the deck, eating and talking and watching the water. "This is my favorite place in the world," he said, looking out at the horizon. "Out here, everything else gets quiet." I understood what he meant. Out on the water, all my anxiety about what I was feeling, about what it meant, about what I should do, it all faded into the background. There was just this moment, this day, this man sitting next to me with the sun in his hair. After we ate, Finn pulled out his rope again. He'd been teaching me decorative knots lately, the kind sailors used to make to pass time on long voyages. He showed me how to make a Turk's head knot, a complex weave that formed a bracelet. "Here," he said, taking my right wrist this time. "Let me tie one on you." I watched his face as he worked, the concentration in his eyes, the slight furrow between his brows. When he finished, he held my wrist in both his hands, admiring his work. "There," he said softly. "Now you've got a matched set." "Finn," I started, not knowing what I was going to say, just knowing I needed to say something. He looked up at me, and the expression in his eyes made my breath catch. "Yeah?" But I chickened out. "Nothing. Just thanks. For today. For teaching me all this stuff." He held my gaze for a long moment, and I thought maybe he was going to say something. But then he just nodded and suggested we head back before the wind changed. That night, I lay in bed, wearing both bracelets, staring at the ceiling, and finally let myself think the thoughts I'd been avoiding. I was falling for Finn. Maybe had already fallen. This wasn't just attraction or curiosity or confusion. This was the real thing, the kind of feeling that songs and poems and novels tried to capture and never quite could. I was in love with him, and I had no idea if he felt the same way, and I was terrified of ruining our friendship by saying anything. The next few weeks were torture. I kept almost saying something, kept almost reaching for his hand, kept almost closing the distance between us in those moments when we stood close together. But every time, fear stopped me. What if I was wrong? What if I was reading signals that weren't there? What if I told him how I felt, and he looked at me with disgust or pity? What if I lost not just him, but this whole life I'd built at the docks? This thing that had finally made me feel like I had a purpose. Then, one Thursday evening, my uncle asked me to stay late to finish some paperwork. By the time I was done, everyone else had gone home except Finn, who was doing maintenance on one of the boats. I found him in the warehouse, working by the light of a single lamp. He looked up when I approached, setting down his tools. "Thought you'd left," he said. "Had to finish some stuff. I'm heading out now." I started to turn away, then stopped. The words were pushing up my throat, demanding to be said. "Finn." "Yeah?" I turned back to face him. "Can I ask you something?" He straightened up, giving me his full attention. "Sure. The rope bracelets. Why did you make them for me?" He was quiet for a moment, his expression unreadable. "You really don't know?" I shook my head. He stepped closer, and my heart started hammering. "Adrian, I've been trying to tell you for months. Every knot I've taught you, every time I've tied rope around your wrists. That's me, trying to say something I don't have words for. "What?" I whispered. He reached out and took my left wrist, his thumb tracing over the monkey's fist bracelet he'd tied there months ago. In the old days, sailors would tie knots for the people they loved, a way to bind them together, even when they were apart. He looked up at me, and his eyes were intense, vulnerable. "I've been binding myself to you since the day we met. I just didn't know if you wanted to be bound back." My brain short-circuited. He'd just said love. He'd just said he'd been trying to tell me something for months. All this time, I'd been agonizing over whether he felt anything for me. And he'd been trying to show me in his own language. The language of knots and rope and sailors' traditions. I started laughing, slightly hysterical with relief. "What's funny?" he asked, looking uncertain now. "I've been losing my mind," I said, trying to figure out if you felt anything for me, trying to figure out what I was even feeling. I've never been with a guy before. Never even thought about it until I met you. And then suddenly I couldn't think about anything else. His expression softened. Yeah, I said. "Finn, I'm completely gone for you. I have been for months." He smiled then, a real smile, the kind I'd only seen a handful of times. "Can I kiss you?" he asked. "God, yes," I said. He cupped my face in his rough, calloused hands and kissed me. And it was like every knot I'd ever learned suddenly made sense. This was what it felt like to be bound to someone. This connection, this rightness, this feeling of being anchored to another person. We kissed in that dim warehouse, surrounded by rope and cargo and the smell of the ocean, and I felt like I was finally home. When we broke apart, we were both breathing hard, grinning at each other like idiots. "So," he said, his forehead resting against mine. "Now what?" "Now we figure it out," I said. "Together." He kissed me again, softer this time, and then took my right wrist. He untied the Turk's head bracelet he'd made, and I felt a moment of panic. "Wait, why are you taking it off?" "Because I want to tie a new one," he said. "This one." He pulled out a fresh piece of rope and began tying, his movements sure and practiced. This is called a true lover's knot. 2 overhand knots that bind together. Can't undo one without undoing both. When he finished, it was beautiful. 2 loops intertwined around my wrist. He tied a matching one on his own wrist. There. Now we match for real. That was 4 years ago. I'm still working at the docks, though I've moved up from inventory to operations management. Finn and I moved in together 2 years ago, into an apartment with a view of the water. We have a small sailboat of our own now, and we spend our weekends out on the ocean. Just the 2 of us and the wind and the waves. My family loves him. My friends love him. My uncle claims he knew all along and has been taking credit for bringing us together ever since. I still wear that true lover's knot on my right wrist. It's faded and worn now, but Finn refuses to replace it. Says it's got our whole story woven into it. He's right. Every time I look at it, I remember that summer when I thought I was just learning about ships and cargo and knots. And instead I learned who I really was. I learned that love doesn't always follow the path you expect. Sometimes it shows up in the form of a quiet shiphand who speaks in rope and knots, who teaches you a language you didn't know you needed to learn. Finn still ties knots on my wrists sometimes, usually when we're sitting on our couch watching the sunset through our window. He'll take my hand and tie some elaborate decorative knot, his fingers moving with that same practiced grace that first caught my attention. Sometimes he ties them loose so I can slip them off. But that first true lover's knot, the one he tied in the warehouse, the night we finally said what we'd been feeling for months, that one stays. That one's permanent. We've talked about getting it tattooed, the pattern of that knot, somewhere visible. A reminder that some bindings are meant to last forever. People ask me sometimes if it was hard, coming out in my 20s, realizing I was attracted to men. I tell them the truth. It wasn't the being attracted to men part that was hard. It was the being brave enough to admit it, first to myself and then to him. It was unlearning all the assumptions I'd made about who I was supposed to be and accepting who I actually was. But once I did that, once I stopped fighting it and just let myself fall, everything else was easy. Loving Finn is the easiest thing I've ever done. Last week, Finn taught me one more knot. A ring knot, he called it, woven from a single piece of rope into a perfect circle. He tied it carefully, precisely, and when he finished, he held it up to the light. "What's that for?" I asked. He looked at me with those sea glass eyes I've been staring into for 4 years now, and he smiled. "I'm still working up to it," he said. "But when I'm ready, I'll show you." I have a feeling I know what he means. I have a feeling that knot isn't going to stay just a knot for much longer. And when he's ready, when he shows me what it's really for, I know exactly what I'm going to say. Yes. Always yes. Because he tied the first knot around my wrist to show me something, and he never untied the last one. And I never want him to.